Hello everyone, my name is Shannon Jolly, and today for my Facilitator's Corner I will be talking about an article entitled Gender Differences in Creativity, and it is written by John Baer and James Kaufman. It was published in the Journal of Creative Behavior in 2008, and it is facilitated by yours truly. The purpose of this article was to kind of deeply examine the innate gender differences in creativity. The article kind of talks about scores on creativity tests, creative achievement, specific developmental periods. So that's kind of like how interests change from as your children to as your adults, and how your preferences and everything changes as far as your creativity is involved. And then lastly, the article talks about a proposal of a new theoretical framework, and that is the APT model of creativity. And this model is just a domain-specific model to help better understand gender differences and why you have changes over time based off of your gender in creativity. So the developmental theories for children, young boys who scored high on divergent thinking tests were rated as more playful, open, and curious. And that was found in a study by Singer and Rumo. What was interesting about that was that they were saying it is the completely opposite for females. So typically they said that those that scored high in divergent thinking tend to be a little more secluded, introverted, and not very curious at all. So I thought that was a pretty interesting finding. And from that, Singer and Rumo also found that the way the young children explore novel toys are positively correlated with their divergent thinking and creativity. And with that, they at least found that to be the case for young boys as well. They were saying how failure to explore novel toys correlated to negative divergent thinking tests for boys. And interestingly enough, for girls, they were saying the way that they process creativity, when they are linguistically and socially competent, they engage in more symbolic play than young boys. So their type of interest or exploration looks different for young girls versus young boys, just based off of their maturity. So developmental theories in adults. Here we found that girls do not show less creative attachment until after high school and college. And they kind of credit that to the idea of, it kind of goes into the whole heterosexism idea of the social constructs of gender roles and how they become a little more salient as we get older. So typically, once females have graduated from high school or college, they start to consider their role as a wife or a parent. And just quite naturally, I think some of those identities end up superseding their personal goals or personal interests or aspirations. So those gender roles become more salient, which prevent their creative achievement. And so from there, women tend to become more interested in the creative product versus the end result. So the study also talks about how women lag behind men in creative achievement and what they get out of life, whether that be career-wise. And it said after a certain age, because women do become more involved with their gender roles, they become the intrinsic reward kind of supersedes the extrinsic. So they're not doing it for the money or for the fame or the reward, but mostly because it just genuinely makes them happy. So with that, they would be more interested in the product itself versus what they get out of it. And here they kind of talked about accredited that to why you have more men that have like publications and research than you do women. Gender differences in creativity overall. Women and girls tend to score higher on creativity tests than men and boys. What was interesting about that is that the article kind of talks about how can you really go off of that, because just as many studies that say women and girls score higher, you do have studies that show the opposite. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. I guess it depends on the context of how you're looking at it. And also, as I mentioned before, the cultural values such as the social roles and sexism are kind of the key reasons for the lack of creative accomplishment by women. I think typically just living in a heteronormative society where you're essentially what in quotation is considered your normal or everyday person is that of a white male cisgendered heterosexual able-bodied middle class male. And so typically anyone that is outside of that norm, whether it be a person or experience, they're seen as deviant. So that does kind of conflict with the level of achievement that is associated with women, especially women of color. In addition, the article talks about the lack of resources necessary to achieve a given microdomain. So, for example, it's just saying if you have a physics teacher, your resources for Arduino bots to help them create robots and machines does not match the resources that you have available for someone who's interested in writing. So you got tons of pen and paper, but you may not necessarily have the tools to expose people to physics at early ages. The article also talks about stereotypic gender appropriate behavior in different domains. So essentially they're just kind of talking about how you would typically ideally think of a PE teacher as a masculine job. There's not really many women that are PE teachers. And then lastly, the article talks about how there are different expectations and access in general thematic areas. Now, the ATP model of creativity, which is basically a model that looks into the gender differences and the different aspects or problems that women face when achieving different levels of creativity and creative productivity. So under this model, it essentially talks about initial requirements, and those are things that are necessary for creative production. So things such as intelligence and motivation, and essentially how all of those things are impacted by their environmental factors. The model also talks about general thematics, which are the skills, traits, and knowledge that promote creativity, and how those skills and traits are limited based off of those socially constructed gender roles and gender norms. And then you have domains, which are the limited factors that promote creativity in specific areas. And then you have your micro domains, which are your very specialized knowledge that must be mastered to contribute. So there they kind of talk about your really specialized areas, such as like anesthesiology and things of that nature. So just relating these gender gaps back to like my personal experience working within STEM, as most of you know, I'm sure that there are pretty huge gaps as far as women, and even larger gaps when you consider minorities. So historically, STEM has been seen as a male-dominated field. Microsoft claims that only 8% of women graduate with a STEM degree, and that was in 2018. So it's pretty interesting. And then even from my personal experience, I think that is the reality. You just don't see that many women. I think it's great that I have been able to see an increase in, marketing and pushes for more women and more women of color within the field. I think that's amazing. I think there has been a lot of progress, but obviously there's still lots of room for improvement there. And the article just based off of like my own research and knowing about the gender differences and racial differences within STEM, some of the gender gaps can be credited to over-recruitment of women in STEM. Some researchers say that the over-recruitment can sometimes still contribute to the idea that STEM is only for males. So while you're thinking that recruitment del Sol, that we're trying to be welcoming, subconsciously it's telling women that STEM may not be safe for women because it's male dominated, because they're recruiting too heavy for women. So yeah, it's a pretty interesting thought behind it, but it does make sense. And the numbers show that it makes sense as well. Another reason for the gender gaps has been accredited to a lack of the introductory classes being more welcoming to women. So now that they're really starting STEM in high schools and middle schools, they're trying to even out the playing field by introducing it to everyone early on, So I think that's a very good way to look at it. The National Science Foundation has been doing a lot to try to make sure that all boys and girls are both exposed to STEM early on, just because of the benefits further down the line, and to increase the number of students who do pursue STEM post high school. And then lastly, I think the reality of it is, because it's been such a male-dominated field, you have a lack of female role models, which can be intimidating for anyone. And I think just looking at like social congruity theory, it's just the idea of having someone look like you to help you makes you feel more comfortable. And so you are starting to see a lot of companies such as Google and Microsoft and NCR, like they're all, as I mentioned before, trying to encourage more women to get into STEM. So Microsoft has this campaign where they talk about make what's next, and where they really highlight the role that women play in STEM and within Microsoft, and some of their leadership positions and what they're doing. So I think as we continue to create foster a more inclusive environment within STEM, those gaps will start to close. And specifically with those gaps, so they are showing that women do go into science and math, but the huge gaps are in technology and engineering. So the question that I have for you: in your classroom, do you notice a difference in creativity between girls and boys? If so, why do you think that is? And then secondly, the author suggests environmental factors impact the level of creativity reached by women and men as adults. Do you agree with that? Why or why not? And here are my references. And thank you for listening to my facilitation.